Hello, I'm Commander Dennis Spence, and in this podcast, I'm going to be talking about how to navigate the Institutional Review Board. This presentation was developed by Ms. Rhonda Allen, who is one of our research facilitators at Naval Medical Center San Diego. It's a standard disclaimer, and the views expressed in this work are those of the authors and do not reflect the official policy or position of the Department of Army, Navy, Air Force, Department of Defense, or the United States government, or the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. Now, some of the information provided here may not apply to your local IRB, and personnel are advised to contact their local IRB administrator for details on specific procedures for submitting protocols. So I have my main objective in this podcast is I'm going to describe how to navigate an Institutional Review Board review. And as I mentioned, some of these details may not apply at your institution, and you should check with your IRB. Also, it's important to note that many commands require performance improvement projects done by military nurses to be routed through the Nursing Research Department. So find out what the specific requirements are at your local institution. And I always recommend that you check with your local, regional, or command nurse researcher. So what is an Institutional Review Board? It's also known as an IEC, an Independent Ethics Committee, and it's formally designated to approve, monitor, and review research involving human subjects. What the IRB does is they look at the risks to the subjects, and the ultimate goal of the IRB is to protect the subjects, not to help the investigators get their study done. It's typically made up of board members of various disciplines, both medicine, nursing, allied health, as well as you typically will have non-medical personnel on the boards. Sometimes you'll even have a chaplain on the board, maybe a lawyer. You have a chairman who oversees the board, and meeting times will vary depending on the workload. Many institutions have bi-monthly meetings. Some smaller commands may have monthly meetings. And if you're at a small military treatment facility, you may not have an IRB, but you may have one in your region which has oversight over research at your institution. So what's the definition of research? Research is a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. And this is taken straight out of the 45 CFR 46.102. In contrast, performance improvement, or even quality improvement, or process improvement is really a systematic data-guided activity designed to bring about immediate improvement in healthcare delivery at your local setting or institution. And sometimes these performance improvement projects, depending on what's being collected and who you're sharing that information with and how you're going about it, may have some may be generating new knowledge or may be collecting personally identifiable information, in which case it may need to be reviewed by an institutional review board. So what is a human subjects? It's a living individual about whom an investigator conducting research is obtaining data through intervention or interaction with the individual, or through examination or collection of identifiable private information. Research and performance improvement, as I just mentioned, is part of a continuum. You go from the spectrum of clinical practice at the individual patient level, and then you have performance improvement, which may be systematic experiential learning. It's within the operational context of patient care, and you're trying to provide rapid feedback about trends that shape practice. And you have clinical research, which is distinct from clinical care, and this is designed to contribute to scientific knowledge. However, I will tell you that there is a gray area between performance improvement and clinical research, especially with the push for doctorate of nursing practice and evidence-based practice projects. This table helps provide a little more information on the differences between the two processes. As I mentioned, research, you're generating new knowledge. You may be testing hypotheses. PI, you're examining internal processes that guide improvement, and really the scope of research is generalizable to other patients, settings, and situations, whereas process improvement, performance improvement, is looking at something internal, process specific. In terms of research, many times you may require informed consent. But this may be vary depending on the level of risk and the type of study you're doing. If it's retrospective, many times you can't obtain informed consent, but you have to fill out some paperwork to request a waiver to obtain informed consent. And for process improvement, performance improvement projects, informed consent is generally not required. With research, there's a scientific framework. There's well-designed control. QI, PI projects really focuses on the processes. However, they may use some statistical analysis and different methods to analyze their results. However, you have to remember when viewing the results that you view it in the context that this is a PI, QI, EBP type project. For subject selection, it's based on your research purpose, study design, your power analysis, and your statistical models. Whereas PI, EBP, is available based on the available patients or the subpopulation of patients. And this is one of the reasons why sometimes you can't necessarily generalize QI or PI projects. And your results are for research are presented and available to others, and many times QI or PI projects are used by the specific institution or organization. However, investigators who do these type of projects or EBP projects, which I would clump into many times the PI, QI category, may be shared with other people. You want to be able to share your lessons learned and your best practices. And so there's a growing scientific literature that focuses on these EBP projects. In terms of if you're looking at the level of risk and what is required for a level of institutional review board review, a study that's considered minimal risk would fall into, it may either be an exempt or an expedited review. Anything beyond minimal risk, and this depends on what is the risk in that individual's day-to-day life, and we'll go into a little more details later, will require a full institutional review board review. And one of the fallacies that people think about is that, oh, my study is minimal risk, it's going to get approved a lot faster. You have to remember that there's several layers of review and paperwork that are required to ensure that the investigators are doing the right thing, and that our goal is to protect the patients that are enrolled in your study. And many times what I've found over the years is that even studies that may be exempt or expedited, you may submit it. However, the IRB program analyst or IRB administrator who reviews that is going to review it. They may many times have checklists, and they may ask for more clarification, additional information, paperwork to be filled out before they actually submit it to the IRB. So I think it's important that the investigators, that you all understand that it's best to take the time and effort to get a very polished and thorough product into the IRB at the beginning to make it easier that your project will move to the next level of review. Many times what I find in teaching hospitals or with novice investigators is that they submit the protocol. Maybe they have not gotten adequate mentoring for whatever reason, and they submit it, and then the IRB program analysts, when they finally get to taking a look at it, they may have a lot of questions, and they request this information or clarification or additional work be done. And if you're working in an academic setting, you're a busy clinician, a resident, a nurse, it may be some time before you get to that. So you need to remember that you have to get that stuff done as quickly as possible if you want to get your study moving through. And then obviously after that step, it still has to go to reviewers and to the chairman, and then get routed up through the chain of command and get signed off by your commanding officer. In our case, that's the admiral at Naval Medical Center San Diego, and that sometimes can even take quite a bit of time. So this is not a short process to go through. So what is minimal risk? Minimal risk is the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research, or not greater in of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. It's important to note that the IRB determines the level of risk associated with a certain protocol, not the investigator. And this is another one of those fallacies that investigators have. Now, you may think it'll fall into a minimal risk. You may even think it's an exempt study. However, I've been doing this for a number of years, and many times what I think might have been a minimal risk, an exempt protocol, actually ended up being expedited. And so you have to use those people at your command, your administrators and your IRB personnel, who are the experts in this. And they're the ones who are going to make that ultimate determination. What is the scope of the IRB review? All research that uses human subjects, tissues, specimens from humans, or data from records may require a review. Quality assurance, quality improvement, and program evaluations have the potential to involve human subjects and collection of personally identifiable information, and therefore may be subject to IRB oversight. This is a flow diagram from the Health and Human Services, and this is our Institutional Review Board uses these when initially trying to make the determination of the category in which a particular protocol falls into. So the first question they ask, is the activity a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute generalizable knowledge? If it's no, the activity may not be considered research. However, there's more stipulations. If it is considered research, then does the research involve obtaining information about living individuals? And if it's no, then it may not be research, but there's other things that apply. And we'll get into that a little bit later. And there's three levels of review: exempt, expedited, and then a convened or a full IRB board review. In terms of exempt protocols, the key is that you have no personally identifiable information collected ever. And in some cases, depending on the interpretation of your IRB, this may mean that you're only looking in, say, one database, and you're not recording down any sort of patient identifiable information, so that you then go and look in a second database. And so sometimes this can be get to be a gray area. And ultimately, every time I go through this, I always go to my IRB administrators and get clarification from them or from the IRB chairman. Many chart reviews also of this category will require a HIPAA disclosure form and may require a waiver of informed consent. Items to consider to exclude for de-identification, and this is not an all-inclusive list, are listed here. Some things like addresses, zip codes, dates except years, telephone numbers, fax numbers, certainly social security numbers, email addresses, URLs. This is especially important if you're doing a survey type research and you're using an electronic survey system such as SurveyMonkey. Any sort of biometric identifiers. Rank is also considered identifiable. And you can see more of that information in there. Internet protocol addresses and so on. And so those are things that if you're trying to get an exempt study, you need to make sure none of that information is in there. Many times what I do when talking with nurses that are doing some of these EBP projects is I recommend that they avoid collecting any personally identifiable information. Maybe you're looking at a process of your patients who have gestational diabetes and looking at the percent of them who have testing completed within 6 weeks after 6 or 12 weeks after delivery. And this is part of a spearheading an initiative. And all you're going to do is look in a single database to see whether or not they got the testing done. and all you're going to do is report the percent of patients, and you're not going to record or collect any additional information, then that may be considered an exempt, and in some cases it may even be not require an IRB review. But each time it's important to check with the IRB administrators to clarify that. An expedited review is minimal risk in certain specific research categories, and chart reviews needing a temporary link, i.e. a list of names or patient identifiers, and this may be where you're going through and checking multiple databases, cross-referencing them. This can fall into an expedited category. Minimal risk is many times just considered blood draws or just questionnaires, though it depends on what type of questions you're asking. Typically, it's only on-label use of medications or devices, and non-invasive standard of practice, and typically it's really following what's the routine standard of care. For example, several years ago we did a study where we were studying the phenomenon of preoperative stress in patients coming in for surgery. And students of mine were collecting baseline information, having the patients fill out some psychometric questionnaires, some psychological, using tools to measure their anxiety and stress at baseline, and then we collected saliva samples when they came to our preoperative holding area prior to going in the OR. And then once the study was done, and all we did was collect information from the records, and so that fell into an expedited review. A full board is any study that's more than minimal risk. And minimal risk when criteria is not met for an expedited review. Additionally, the IRB chairman can deem any study that he may request that a full board review a particular study, especially if it's a controversial or a high-profile type study. And these, if a classic example of a study that require an IRB review would be a randomized controlled trial comparing a new drug therapy, say for depression, compared to a gold standard treatment. So do you need an investigational new drug or IDE application? You may from the Federal Drug Administration. The questions you have to ask, and this is where IRB administrators can help you, is are you using a drug that is not FDA approved for what you're intending to study it for? And are you planning to use that drug that is FDA approved, but you plan to use it in another indication or at a route of administration or dose that put the patient at more risk? If you do, you may need to submit an investigational new drug exemption. And also the same thing applies for an IDE for devices. The IRB will many times make that determination, and relatively, at least I've had some experience with this when we did a study in the past, and it's a fairly straightforward, some paperwork you fill out, your IRB can help you with it, and they forward that on to the FDA, and many times a non-response is sometimes deemed that it's okay to press on, but you need to check with your local IRB on this. So what are some first things first? Well, we need to determine the level of IRB oversight, because this may determine what type of paperwork is required. In terms of if you're in the Navy, out at Naval Medical Center San Diego, or really at any doing research in any naval institution, as well as I think many of the military organizations, you have to complete what's called CITI training, which this is human subjects risk training. You need to check with your IRB in terms of which level of type of the program you need to take. In the Navy, you have to complete research integrity training 4 hours every 3 years. You need to check with your local command in terms of what their process is for allowing you to obtain that training. You need to obtain an IRB net account, and you need to check with your local IRB whether or not this is something that you do. I believe in the Army, Navy, and Air Force, many of the IRBs use that system, but they may or may not. You need to complete all forms and templates that are required. Many of the IRBs will have checklists to remind you what you need to complete. You need to complete and submit the full package onto IRBnet and any additional references or resources they may require. and everything is done electronically through IRBnet, and many times even electronic signatures are acceptable. However, you need to check with your local IRB in terms of what their requirements are. I think it's very important that early on you contact your IRB administrator or program analyst to help you out with these processes. You can give them a title, and they many times will give you a protocol number, which you can use for reference. You can use this clinical investigations program number as a reference for all communications on your protocol. And as I mentioned, I can't stress this enough, use the local checklists to really help you, remind you of what paperwork you need, and this may help you in the long run. Do you need a collaborative research and development agreement, or CRADA, or a memorandum of understanding? This sometimes it really depends on who are you working with. Are you sharing intellectual property or funding? This is CRADAs are typically involved with if you're dealing with grant funding in a grant organization such as Geneva or Henry Jackson Foundation. This many times applies. Sometimes if you're working with civilian academic centers, or even drug labs or companies, they may require this. And this, if you're working between military institutions, if you don't have a memorandum of understanding in place, you may be required. Sometimes we have these with academic centers as well, and other organizations. And if you're working with these others, you may require to complete this paperwork. And typically at your institution, there's somebody that's full-time that's dedicated to doing this. The good thing is many times you can get this process moving concurrently while your IRB package is being reviewed. And sometimes this, depending on where you are, this can be as short as only taking 60 days to greater than 6 months, depending on the process. So you need to contact your local IRB and your CRADA officer who can help you with this. What are some just general checklist information for an exempt status? You can have your protocol number, how many subjects you anticipate you may need, and sometimes you just need to take a rough guess. Your information, and then you're going to be attaching a proposal, data collection sheets, a budget, or create an info sheet, as well as you have to get a scientific review. If you're at Naval Medical Center San Diego, we have a process of requiring a scientific review by somebody with expertise in your area that reviews it, and then we have a second level review of the science within the clinical investigations department, which is done by our science director as well as by our statistician. Other institutions may have a separate scientific review board that reviews the science behind the proposal, and then the IRB reviews the human subjects risks. So you need to check with your local institutional review board to see what the process is and what is required. You also need the CV and CD completion certificates, as well as the responsible conduct of research certificates. For chart review with temporary list of identifiers, this may be an expedited review. You'll have a human proposal form that you'll complete. You may have NA in Section E, and this is more specific in terms of at Naval Medical Center San Diego. You'll have to have a memo requesting a waiver of assigned informed consent and a PHI form. For a full human proposal, this is just a listing of the a checklist for you to think about. And what are the generic components of a human proposal or a research protocol? And this varies from place to place, but it's more or less pretty consistent. You'll have an abstract, which is really one succinct paragraph describing the background, methods, results, and your anticipated conclusions. You'll have your investigator information, all of the people are involved, as well as a human assurance form signatures. You'll have a budget, if applicable. The background of significance is typically you're trying to brief and get to the point, though the length of this may vary. It's typically 1 to 2 pages, but it may be longer. If you're working on something, say a grant proposal, I don't like to reinvent the wheel. Many times you can just cut and paste and adapt what you're doing for one process and use it for the other. You need to have your specific objectives and your research question. You need to be very clear in terms of what your purpose is and what are the aims of this project. You need to talk about any previous work that's been done. If not, you should state that no other work's been done. And you get into the research design. And then typically you have a general approach of what your design is, how you're going about it, who your subject population is, both inclusion, exclusion criteria, and then any specific applicability in terms of investigational new drugs. How are you going to analyze your results? How did you determine your sample size? And is it relevant to the military? And like I said, some of these sections may or may not apply at your local institution. You need to try and keep things in layman terms. You need to really provide as much detail as possible so that the investigator understands what you're doing. You need to remember that many times people on the IRB that are reviewing this may not have expertise in your area, so they may not be familiar with your jargon that you use. So I generally recommend minimizing the acronyms whenever possible. One is it makes it really hard to read, and two, it's just difficult to remember if you have a number of acronyms throughout the protocol. And you need to really spell out in terms of what are the risks, even down to how are you going to ensure privacy. What databases are you going into? What's the name of those databases? What information are you collecting? What are the risks? How are you storing that information? What is the process for obtaining informed consent? What is the experimental procedure or study intervention? You have to remember that one of the things I tell investigators is that the way you write a research manuscript for publication and the way you write an IRB protocol are similar but very different. For an IRB protocol, you need to have much more information in detail. For a manuscript, it's written much more concisely, and many of those details are left out. It's better to provide more information at the beginning than not, because inevitably what happens is the reviewers may come up with questions, and they're going to turn around and send it back to you, and that may delay your study getting approved. In terms of also, there's a section for application to use of human subjects. So you may have a section that talks about just the science behind the project. Then you need it, and some of that information may be redundant. However, I think for completeness, you need to fill out all the sections of the protocol. So you may then get to the section where it talks about the human subjects risks, and this is how you're ensuring the safety of the study. You know, how are you ensuring privacy? Do you have a data safety monitoring plan if it's applicable? What are the risks? You know, if you're using laser radiations, you may need approval from another committee. You need to really justify the risks of the study and how you're going to minimize those risks. For studies that are more than minimal risk, they will require a medical monitor, which in this case needs to be, at least in the military, this is a physician or a dental corps officer. On your data collection sheets, you need to include these. Don't assume that they'll understand what you're doing. Whatever you're using to record that information needs to be included. Or if you're using an electronic database, maybe just a copy of that spread of a screen capture. No patient identifiers on your data collection sheets, so you can have a master subject logbook. And that should be kept in a locked file cabinet separate from the data. What are your outcomes? Do you have a suitable, are they suitable for the research question and the planned analysis? Are the tools validated? Have you obtained permission to use those questionnaires? All that information needs to be provided and included. In terms of the informed consent, it needs to be written at the 8th grade reading level. What I do is write the consent and have my wife read it, somebody who has very little medical knowledge. See if they understand it. And if a risk is mentioned in the protocol, it needs to be in the consent. So you need to kind of look back and forth and see what information you need. You can use Microsoft Word to use the grammar and grade level, reading level check to check the areas. The consent form, you may, in some cases for minimal risk studies that are where you are enrolling patients prospectively, you may have an information sheet as opposed to a consent. And if it's a retrospective chart review or even many exempt studies, you may have a waiver of informed consent, which this is defined as only harm is the breach of confidentiality. And then the consent document would be the only document linking the subject to the study. In terms of a scientific review, this is for any new protocols, including exempt studies, at least at our institution, or major modifications may require this. And I mentioned some IRBs may have separate review boards, and this needs to be a qualified person who understands the science. You need to check with your local IRB requirements. They may actually have a checklist that individual uses, or a template. And this must be a subject matter expert, and it cannot be a fellow or resident or intern at Naval Medical Center San Diego. They need to have some familiarity with the methods. They also need to have completed the CITI and responsible conduct of research training, and they need to be independent of the study. They can't be part of the study team. And as I mentioned, at Naval Medical Center San Diego, our scientific director will do a second level review. In addition, our statistician, Dr. Riffenberg, will do a review as well. So what are the steps that your proposal will go through at Naval Medical Center San Diego? Now this process may be similar at other institutions, and it may be different. But generally what happens is protocols get submitted to the IRB administrators, the program analysts. They review it. They go back and forth with the investigator asking for more information or clarification. And then depending on the level of review, it'll either be an exempt, expedited, or full board review. Once it goes to that, many times expedited and full board reviews, there may be modifications that are required. This is pretty typical, and so then the minutes will get generated, and then the requested changes will get sent back to the investigator. They'll make the changes, resubmit, and then the IRB chairman will review it. Now, when the full board reviews the study, they may, depending on the study, they may approve it. They may approve it with modifications, minor or major. In some cases, they may ask the investigator to come back and represent. Even in rare, but it does sometimes occur, they may table a study, or they may not even approve it altogether. So then what happens is all those changes are made, and then it goes to the IRB chairman. He approves them, and then the minutes from the meetings get routed up the chain of command. And sometimes this can be a quite lengthy process depending on your institution. Concurrently, the CRADA MOU process can be going on, and then once the minutes are approved by in our case, the admiral, then they get sent back to the department head of clinical investigations, who signs them off, and then the IRB administrators will notify and give the approval letter to the investigators. Now, if a CRADA or a MOU is required, you may get approval all the way through the CO, but they may not approve, give you your start letter until that process and paperwork has been established. What is an anticipated timeline? And this is going to vary from institution. Without a CRADA, in the past at Naval Medical Center San Diego, we said this can take 6 to 8 weeks. My general experience recently, and this is we're in April 2013 because of budget cuts and sequestration potential coming here in the very near future. Our time is probably closer to anywhere from 3 to 6 months, depending on the study. Now, many times what happens is there's a lot of things that need to be done on the protocol before the IRB administrator even submits it for board review. But this can vary. And like I said, all decisions have to be signed off by the commanding officer before you can conduct the research. With a CRADA, And this is dependent upon, like I said, complete CRADA information, and then this goes back and forth between all the institutions. So depending on what you're doing and who your collaborators are, each one of those organizations needs to approve the statement of work and what's going on. And so this will vary, and this may add even an extended period of time on studies. So what are your, after approval, your study gets approved, what's your responsibilities? Every year you're going to have an annual review of the study by the IRB. At least at our institution, you'll get a reminder email as a courtesy, and you'll have a continuing review form that you'll complete through IRB.net, and this process may vary at other institutions. You need to bring, if you have consents, you need to bring them to the meeting. The IRB may require more frequent review, and you need to do your continuing review, or your study could be administratively closed. And this is sometimes a problem we have with deployments, dealing with residents and people that rotate out. In terms of your data, you need to make sure that where's the location of your logbook? Make sure it's locked up, and make sure that you're properly handling all the de-identified data, and make sure that the data you've collected is de-identified, that it does not have any PII like Social Security numbers or names on them. And if you have any safety issues and there's an adverse event, depending on the significance of that event, it may need to be reported within 24 business hours. You need to check with the IRB, and if you have a question, and if it's something that's even what you might consider a normal part of standard of care, however this patient's in part of a research study, then you may need to submit an adverse drug event. For example, we did a study a couple of years ago where we were evaluating the use of gabapentin as a adjunct for postoperative analgesia after shoulder arthroscopy. And we had a patient that went to the emergency room because of severe muscle pain. When we went back and looked at his record, he had received succinylcholine, which has a known side effect of postoperative myalgia after anesthesia. And so we determined that was what the cause was. But however, because he had reported this adverse event, we had to fill out the paperwork and submit that within 24 hours to the IRB chairman, even though it didn't have any effect on the study. And that's normal in routine practice. The problem is if you get into is if you don't do that, and then the IRB finds out about it later, then they may scrutinize your study. They could potentially even put a hold on your study. So if there's any safety reports that occur, and also this is where when you have these issues, that's where you work through your medical monitor, and that's what they're there for. And then if we're looking at modifications, many times studies require changes. The IRB needs to know those, and they need to approve them. You need to submit a memorandum and any supporting documentation. If it's a minor change, maybe it's a change in PI or a slight change in the protocol, you submit that, the chairman will approve it. Major modifications are going to require more information. They may even require a scientific review, and they may require a full IRB review. And amendments are changes made by the investigator after the protocol has been submitted, approved, and started. Once you complete your study, you need to submit a completion report, and this is going to vary from institution to institution. You may have continuing reviews form to complete as well if subjects were enrolled during that time period. And you may need to contact at least our institution or medical editor for assistance with presentations or publications of your results, as well as ensuring that you get PAO clearance if you're in the military. What's the definition of a closed or completed study? A completed study is the research question has been answered, and you have de-identified the data and now entering in your analysis phase. A PI request closure means you cannot answer your scientific question anymore. Maybe due to poor recruitment, no longer scientifically valid, and you request that your study be closed. Or you've completed the study and you no longer need to do the analysis. If it's administratively closed, the IRB has closed your study due to lack of or non-compliance with requirements by the IRB, in which case you can't collect any more information, you can't analyze it, you can't publish your results. Don't abandon a study. Make sure that you turn it over to somebody that will have a vested interest and ensure that the study gets done. or suspend the study pending your return. But you still need to assign your administrative PI responsibilities over to somebody, especially if an audit is required or a continuing review comes up. What are some steps to consider? And this is focused on nurses doing research. I think you need to contact your regional nurse researcher first. Contact them very early so they can help you understand the various processes of what you're doing. So they can check with them to see what the requirements are, if there's any standard operating procedures that they go by. Determine which IRB has oversight. This depends on where you're doing the research. For example, we had a study recently that's being conducted up in Washington by one of our Navy nurses, and she's actually collecting data on patients at Madigan Army Medical Center. And so our Navy IRB doesn't have oversight over that study. However, the Madigan IRB would. Now, if she was enrolling subjects at Bremerton as well, then IRB may also have to do that review. So sometimes you may have more than one IRB that reviews it. Also, if you're a graduate student conducting a research or an EBP project that requires IRB oversight, you may have a second level review at your university after the primary IRB reviews it. In terms of the Navy, the principal investigator must be assigned at that facility, meaning they must be staffed, and that's what it says on their orders. An example of this would be, say, a carrier nurse wants to do a retrospective chart review of sailors seen at Naval Medical Center San Diego for some particular problem or research question. They would have to find a local PI at Naval Medical Center San Diego to be responsible and submit the paperwork on their behalf. Also, that local PI is on the hook for if there's any issues with that study. You're going to need letters of support from the commanding officer, OICs, to recruit the sailors or subjects in some circumstances. You need to complete all that necessary training I talked about before. If you need some help in terms of resources in scientific design, evidence-based practice process, you can go to our the website listed here, the Tri-Service Nursing Research and EBP resource page. This is on Mill book. And this has many of these podcasts, and if you're viewing this podcast, this is probably where you've been already. At Naval Medical Center San Diego, what we like to have is a 1 to 2 page summary that we can help work with you, and it really explains the nuts and bolts, and it really describes what data you're collecting, what databases, and many times we can take that to our IRB administrators and determine what type of submission this may be. You need to make sure you get all that paperwork in and make all the changes and additional information the IRB administrator needs before they can send it up, and need to determine if a CRADA is needed. And like I said, this process can take 3 to 6 months or longer to get approved, at least at our institution these days. We're hoping that number will get less. Other institutions, it may be as short as 60 days. And I think it's important that you need to know who your administrative research staff are and see how they can help you. Here's some references to help guide you. And another excellent program is the Tri-Service Nursing Research Program. They have excellent resources. They also have links to our research and scientific writing podcast series, which are posted on YouTube. You can get those through their website, or you can go on YouTube and type TSNRP in the keyword search, and the videos will come up.